Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
And today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing just exactly the same problem, just exactly the same conflict.
So, for those of you who've been following us this season on Diplomatic Immunity, we've been asking our guests a lot lately about what they find to be some of the unsung success stories of the United Nations system. Most of the time, the answers we've been getting are naming institutions and agencies we've never even heard of, but that make a major difference in our lives, such as the International Civil Aviation Organization or the International Maritime Organization. But these are all normally multilateral organizations that set standards, provide data, or just kind of help integrate global markets and systems. So, extremely important agencies, but things that we don't really hear of that much. As many of you also know, we here at ISD have done quite a bit on global food security, and we did one of our new Global Commons working groups on it a couple years ago, and we've written pieces in War on the Rocks on the issue of food security and national security. So we decided to dive into one of the organizations that we've really come to appreciate over the past couple of years, and that's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. That's a mouthful, so from here on out, we'll just be saying FAO. Makes it a lot easier. The FAO was founded in the aftermath of World War II at the same time as many of these different institutes and agencies that we've talked about at the United Nations. And it's been committed to ending hunger since that time. And it does so mostly through its programmatic expertise and its collection of data. It's one of these agencies at the UN that really dives down into the numbers and gives us all of the information and data we need when talking about food security or food insecurity. So for this episode, we had the pleasure of speaking to a fellow Hoya and the Deputy Director General of the FAO, Beth Bechdol. Beth is responsible for FAO's partnership and outreach work, including UN collaboration, resource mobilization, private sector engagement, and South-South and triangular cooperation. She oversees plant production and protection programs, FAO's Technical Advisory Committee on Agriculture, and the International Plant Protection Convention Secretariat. Before joining FAO, Beth was president and CEO of AgriNovus Indiana. Prior to this, she served as a chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and an economist on the Senate Agriculture Committee. Beth holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and a master's from Purdue University in agricultural economics. If you're interested in any of this stuff we talk about on food security and want to find out more, you can check out IST's latest work on global food security, linked in today's show notes. Let's listen to the conversation. Beth, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Kelly, for the invitation.
Yeah, you bet. And, our listeners to Diplomatic Immunity are no strangers to food security and food insecurity. And we've had some episodes touching on this in the past. But I think it's going to be interesting today to get sort of an update on where we are on these things and to look at it specifically from the Food and Agriculture Organization standpoint. So with that being said, can you just start things off by sort of telling folks what is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and give us an idea of how it operates and just what you guys do.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this question because I think actually in some ways we're a little bit of one of the, I don't want to say necessarily underappreciated, but not necessarily high profile or really well-known agencies within the UN system. So we are the specialized agency that deals with food and agriculture. And our mandate is really about taking the lead on the global efforts to end hunger. So we have a direct line to the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically SDG 2. Zero hunger. And in the context of that, we also focus on reducing rural based poverty and improving the productivity of farmers, smallholder farmers all around the world. Today, we have 195 members. We have 130 country offices. So we are an organization of about 15,000 people. 3,000 of us headquartered in Rome, Italy, where our global headquarters are, and then the other 12,000 team members all around the country, all around the world, working on a number of very important technical issues to support these issues around food security. Let me really quickly just maybe walk you and the listeners through kind of our core functions or what really is at the heart of our work. The first is that FAO is really considered the world leader in providing data and market analysis on global food prices, on commodities, and the overall state of global food and agriculture. The second area of work for us is that we are also the home, the custodian, the owner, the convener of development of global international standards for food safety. So the Codex Alimentarius sits in our organization, and also for trade in plant and plant health. So again, a place where countries come together to really put the right kind of regulatory procedures and bring harmonization to those standards is another really important function. The third is that we work a lot and increasingly more and more in emergency and humanitarian settings. And this is a unique space for us because we aren't seen as a humanitarian agency or organization within the UN system. But more and more, we'll talk about this, I hope, as the podcast goes on, we're finding that many of the people who are the most acutely food insecure in the world are directly tied to agriculture. They're farmers, they're livestock herders. And so the kind of agricultural technical assistance that needs to be provided in these settings is really important. And then our last space actually sort of crosses the nexus and moves into development and resilience. And so FAO is made up of just hundreds of experts in water management, in fisheries and aquaculture, in forestry, in seed systems. And all of these places are areas where we provide technical capacity to countries to put the right systems, to put the right policies, to put the right practices in place so that we can really elevate global food and agriculture.
That's great. Thanks. And we'll definitely get into that humanitarian assistance aspect of what you guys do. But I want to start off with the first aspect that you touched on, and that's the data part of what FAO does. And you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. And when those came out in 2015, the world was in a little bit of a different place as far as food security is concerned and where it was heading. But what we've seen in the last 8 years is that it's actually heading in the wrong direction. So as we get into more of these actual discussions on issues and humanitarian aid and things like that, can you give our listeners an idea of what is the state of food security or insecurity today? And is it getting better or has it been getting worse? Where are we?
Yeah, you're spot on. We are definitely off track, and to be really honest and very candid about it, I was actually on a call not that long ago where Secretary General Guterres was speaking to a number of us from inside the UN system, and I don't think I'm giving anything away, but when you hear the SG talk about rescuing the Sustainable Development Goals, not redoubling, not recommitting, not accelerating, but rescuing the Sustainable Development Goals, because so many of them, not just zero hunger and the space that we operate in as it relates to global food security, but a number of them are really in trajectories and on pathways to not meet the goals that we set for ourselves in 2030. And that's certainly the case for food insecurity, for hunger, and for malnutrition. So today, we are now, I think, 4 years into hitting our peak improvement period in about 2015. Actually, more years than that. That would be, going on 7 or 8 years now, where we've seen just a continued deterioration, a continued decline in the progress that was being made. So today we have about 830 million people who we consider to be hungry on any given day. These are acutely food insecure individuals. More and more, what we are finding is this is driven by conflict. It's being driven by crisis. And when we really look at the worst of the worst, there are probably 250 plus million people who are in beyond emergency, near catastrophe settings. And they are finding themselves in almost 60 different countries around the world. So this larger number of 828 million sort of takes the global perspective on hunger, developed and developing worlds. But when you really narrow in on the places that are in crisis mode, mostly driven by conflict, but it may be economic downturns, severe economic declines. A lot of it is also increasingly being driven by the climate crisis. Those numbers are really alarming. And what's even more concerning to me is the numbers that are in the just on the margins, just on the tipping point scale continue to go up well. So it's not just in our classification settings, the group of people who are by definition acutely food insecure. It's another 280 million people that are just right on the precipice of falling back into some very severe hunger positions. Alongside that, though, besides just the availability or the accessibility of food is also the issue around nutrition. And this, too, I think is really important in the discussions around global food security, is that today we estimate that 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. So we have to not only think about the quantities or the supplies of food that become available in these difficult settings, but we also have a responsibility, all of us, as not only the sort of global community, but national governments and other people who have the ability to influence, to make sure that there is high quality, affordable, and nutritious food that is also being made available around the world. And that's a real challenge, where this is where the other parts of FAO come in, is how do you reconfigure, how do you think differently about agricultural supply chains? How do you think differently about crop production, crop diversification, trade and logistics come into play? But we're not in a good space. And as I mentioned, we have so many issues that are arising because, again, so many of the people who are going hungry are the people that the world depends on to feed itself. And so when farmers and their families aren't able to produce, to be profitable, to be productive, to support their own families, their communities, their villages, something inside the model of how we have been working in, I think, these crisis or emergency contexts really needs some new thinking.
Yeah, and you mentioned so many things in your answer there that make the food security issue such an important one, but also such an interesting one, because there's so many different drivers and variables involved in food insecurity. Whether you mentioned the conflict driving food insecurity, but then the flip side, food insecurity can drive conflict in some instances.
Exactly.
So you're caught in this cyclical nature. And you mentioned supply chains and where we get our food from and how that can be disruptive. And the price of food has been rising in the last few years, because of COVID and then the war in Ukraine, which we'll get to in a minute. But the nutrition aspect of it too, I think, is a huge issue that's been overlooked for a really long time, but I think is being taken more seriously now. And so, you mentioned those challenges. So, and you talked a little bit about sort of finding new ways to think about these things to fix a lot of these issues or mitigate against them. So why do you think the FAO is maybe situated in a way to be able to do that? Yeah. And what are some of those things that FAO has been doing?
Yeah, so I promise my response isn't intended to sound like a commercial or a plug in any way for our particular organization, but
That's quite if you're doing good things
I,
and
we are doing good things, and
yeah.
I do think agriculture has such an important role to play to be a part of the solution finding to these big challenges. And I can say this pretty passionately. I grew up on a corn, soybean, and wheat farm that my family still operates in rural Indiana in the Midwest, and so this passion and this real understanding of the good things, the good practices, the support that farmers and farming communities provide is something that inherently there's a little bit of personal bias there. But, agriculture can oftentimes be looked as being the contributor to the problem. And that's not to, from my vantage point, not to deny that or to object to that. But I actually think that, there are so many opportunities for agriculture to continue to innovate, to evolve, to put new practices in place, to adopt new technologies that in things like, reducing, greenhouse gas emissions and the effect that we're seeing, of issues around methane emissions and other things in agriculture, we have an opportunity to fix that. And this is where I think an organization like FAO gets to be the sort of global champion or the global advocate for agriculture and agricultural productivity being a part of changing and pivoting on a number of these issues. But let me maybe zero in on one other aspect, which is I'm going to come back to this space of sort of overall global humanitarian investments and the money. Lots of times, it always, tends to come back to the money. And the money flows are not in balance. The money flows historically have been very much short-term, crisis after crisis. It happens in the US, it happens in other capitals around the world. There's supplementals, there's emergency responses, there's quick solutions and budgets that sort of get created to kind of channel and target support. Oftentimes in this very, again, quick turnaround, there's a crisis, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's an ongoing conflict, whether it's floods or something else. Most of the support, almost 90% of all of that global humanitarian support, Kelly, is going to direct food assistance and nutrition assistance. That tends to get really concentrated then in really sort of what I would argue is a bit of a limited response. And what I think really needs to happen is that more global donors, more of the partners who are looking, and it might even include the international financial institutions or the the development banks, we have to start investing in agricultural productivity. And that's where an organization like FAO comes in an emergency setting. And we are alongside the World Food Program, alongside UNICEF, alongside OCHA, other NGO partners. But our value add is we're going to provide seeds, fertilizers, livestock vaccines, livestock or animal feed nutrition that, again, is needed in a crisis, in an emergency humanitarian setting, but needs to be responses that are targeted, tools that are provided, support that is provided directly to those farmers that I was talking about. And personally, I think it's actually one of the most cost-effective investments that anybody can be making. So one very quick example, in Mozambique, for example, with just $5, FAO can come in and vaccinate and provide all of the sustaining care for a farmer's one goat. And I know that sounds so incredibly trivial, that it seems so simple, so modest, something that, we wouldn't even maybe even give a thought or contemplate. But that in turn saves the life of the animal, and the market value of the animal, if someone is to come in and actually replace it, is $75. And that same animal not only provides economic livelihood support for the farmer and his or her family, but it also provides the child in that family with 2 glasses of milk every day. So you're bringing productivity meets nutrition meets, frankly, just respect for people's lives, and how they want to live. And so I think this dialogue and this discussion around how have we as global sort of humanitarians, how have we been investing our dollars one crisis at a time? We're out of balance, and there needs to be some recalibration in how those funding dollars are spent.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the example you gave of the local farmer in Mozambique, I think a lot of times when we think food security or food insecurity, we're thinking, massive agribusinesses and these, conglomerates and everything. But when we did our working group on food insecurity a couple of years ago, it always kept coming back to the local level and the importance of the local level and sort of building up from there, whether or not it was in humanitarian assistance or even sort of developing new plans and ways to farm and to do sustainable development and all of those different things. So, that's an important aspect of it that does get overlooked a lot. Moving on a little bit here, I want to get into, by definition, multilateral means that you're dealing with more than one country at a time. And Russia is part of the FAO, and we have the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine that had a major effect on food prices last year, and we're still
ripple effects.
Still, dealing with, times where this grain deal has to get renegotiated because the initial timeframes are running out and everything. So how has FAO stepped into that void there to help with some of the after effects, some of those ripple effects that you mentioned, and how do you then try to deal when that a country like Russia is a member of FAO? Like, how does that sort of muddy the waters, and how do you continue to move forward with that? That's what makes multilateralism tough.
Yeah, and multilateralism by consensus.
Yes, even tougher. Yeah,
even tougher. And as I said when we started, we have 195 members. 194 are countries, and then we have the European Union as a singular member as well. So with voting capabilities in the organization. But we are an organization that strives to work by consensus. For an organization like ours that is so focused, again, we're a specialized agency. And so, the technical work that we do, we don't want it to be politicized. That's sort of historically just, for a lot of years, how FAO and what we call our governing bodies, whether it's our committees or our council where, members all come together to sort of take on and debate a number of these topics and then give FAO ultimately guidance on what we should be prioritizing and how we should be operating. You do try to reach a good conclusion at the end of those discussions. The war in Ukraine has changed the nature in these last many months of how discussions about agricultural production, agri-food systems, has been taken on board. And in fact, just from a procedural perspective, we are not an organization that oftentimes likes to have votes be taken in our sessions. But since the war in Ukraine in February, right, with the launch in February of 2022, we've had 2 different sessions now of our council, which is our main convening, where votes have been taken on specific language, on phrasing, on direction that's being given to the organization. But for us, we still, despite that, try to still continue to serve all of our members, really irrespective of their development status or some of their political viewpoints. There is a big difference between being in Rome and the navigating of an FAO meeting versus a New York Security Council meeting. But it has permeated into even a number of our more technical meetings, as clearly this is a positioning that is front of mind for so many different countries right now. So when we have opening interventions and make opening statements, we might all be in a place coming together around, say, antimicrobial resistance or One Health discussions. And instead, the opening interventions are statements about the war and about the impacts of the war and how to navigate that. For us, I mean, the guidance that we continue to receive from our members is making sure that more than anything, FAO continues to do its really good work on assessing the impacts of the war in Ukraine and what it means for this, again, the ripple effects throughout the global food security scenario. So we provide data, for example, and analysis into the UN system, the Secretary General's office, into the World Food Program, all tied to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We aren't operating it, we aren't facilitating it, but it's our data and our analysis that oftentimes is right there in the midst of trying to craft these responses. More specifically, though, I would say, I think it's an opportunity to share a little bit. FAO has actually been in Ukraine since 2015. And I think that's a sort of surprising sort of positioning for a lot of people, because so many of us have recognized Ukraine as sort of really this agricultural powerhouse that it really became over the last few decades. But in fact, especially in the eastern part of the country, 1 in 4 Ukrainians were still considered food insecure. And so these small scale farmers, rural households, we had a very strong presence when the war broke out, of already working very closely with the Ministry of Agriculture, with a number of these communities. And so since that time, we have been able to, with so many other UN partners and donors, continue to work to make sure that seeds are provided ahead of each of the, very serious crop calendar cycles, winter wheat, spring wheat, corn, vegetable plantings. But we've also been doing a lot of work really trying to help with the grain storage issues. There have been a lot of concerns about infrastructure that has been destroyed as a part of the war, and making sure that with support from donors, with support from private sector, especially some of the larger agricultural, agribusiness commodity companies have been really instrumental in making sure we get temporary grain storage sleeves and other mechanisms in place so that we can make sure that the productivity of Ukraine, at least not only for their own markets that are needed, but importantly for the global markets that have long depended on grain exports from that particular region, are able to get out. But this is new territory in some ways for an FAO, trying to navigate the politics, trying to still come to center on how do we really take on a number of these global food system challenges, and how does agricultural productivity, how do agricultural value chains, how do logistics, how do issues around fertilizer use and efficiency. There's a lot of long-term issues that are going to come as a result of what's happened over these last, several months.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the research and data aspect of it that you mentioned so much even more important than it already is. And that was a major point in our working groups as well, is the need. There is a lot of research and data out there, but the need for even more to be able to sort of see where things might be taking a turn for the worse, or where things might be affected more by environmental change in the coming decades, so that the organizations like FAO can get that information out to folks so they can plan accordingly and try to mitigate or change supply chains or where things are grown and that kind of stuff.
One of the other things that we've really had to do, we had to do this a lot in the 2007-2008 food crisis that emerged when we had global economic challenges, right on the cusp of the COVID-19 pandemic. And now when the war broke out in Ukraine, there is oftentimes an also sort of instant kind of knee-jerk reaction from some national governments to start putting restrictions, national policies in place to keep food and agricultural production and commodities in their country, as opposed so very limiting market limiting policies that get put in place. And in fact, what we continue to always try to reinforce with those national governments is that in many ways, those types of restrictions on exports or other things that are, again, nationally driven from a priority perspective, end up creating more of the chaos in the global marketplace.
Exactly.
And have the bigger impacts longer term on commodity prices, food price inflation. And so FAO has a real, role to play in advocating in a number of these challenging situations that look, we have to keep markets open. And that's where our network worldwide of having so many of our country offices who have such close relationships with national governments, whether that's ministries of agriculture, ministries of economy and finance, environment, and others, that is a very important leverage point for an organization like FAO to be able to try to bring some of that information to bear so that some of these maybe more holistic or bigger picture decisions that can often be done with a very national kind of domestic agenda, sometimes obviously politicized. We have to try to, I think, bring some of that voice of reason and voice of clarity and transparency to those partners as well.
Yeah, I know. India put an export ban on for a while last year, which again, sort of rocked the food markets a little bit more.
Yep.
And you also have the issue of some countries, buying up farms and land in other countries that maybe isn't an issue today, but could be during the next food crisis and things like that. So, that issue of we actually kind of termed it food nativism, sort of in our working group, is something else to be on the lookout for. But you mentioned. You mentioned donors and agribusinesses when you were talking about Ukraine and like providing the storage facilities and things like that. You mentioned all the partner nations. So who are some of the entities that FAO partners with on the ground? For instance, like when you're getting those drugs to the farmer in Mozambique to give his goat the shot, like who do you guys partner with on a normal basis?
Yeah, so let me maybe talk about a couple of different categories of partners and then sort of get to that specific sort of question you're asking about, right there very locally, who are we engaging with? I think the first sort of place that I really want to emphasize the important commitment we have to partnering is actually within the entirety of the UN sort of system itself. And this is for me, I come from outside FAO. I come from outside the UN system entirely. I've got a lot more experience with private sector than I do with multilateralism. So for me, there's been a lot of sort of eye-opening moments of how many silos really have been built up over a lot of years.
You should work in academia.
Oh my gosh! I can well appreciate the similarities. And there's a lot of effort underway in the UN to really kind of reform the way that we work together, especially at the country level. A lot of things tied to the repositioning and efficiency and reform agendas that have been led by Secretary General Guterres. But for FAO, it has really sparked, I think, a very important transition for us as a partner in really participating very directly in what are called the UN country teams, led by the UN resident coordinators. This is where, especially in these more sort of sense of urgency, emergency, humanitarian settings, FAO probably hadn't really sort of actively participated alongside sort of all of our UN partners for a lot of years, because I think candidly for a lot of our sort of time being in place, we really viewed more of our partners as being the national government counterparts. I mean, to the place where we sort of saw our natural place as supporting the Ministry of Agriculture, supporting the local universities, supporting the local NGOs. And more, given what we talked about at the beginning of this discussion about how far off track we are to really try to achieve this larger, 2030 agenda, FAO's really got to step up its engagement and partnering with the other UN family of business agencies. And I mentioned, I think, as you and I were chatting before we started, we've got 3 very important agencies that are headquartered here in Rome: the World Food Program, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and FAO. And the 3 of us are really recommitting to, I think, more collaboration together around how each of us have a very distinct and sort of unique role at the country level and to support on these global food issues. But really, I think the area that we've really sort of broken through on is more of what I mentioned earlier, which is private sector engagement. So before I came, I've heard stories from colleagues about, FAO really sort of very much keeping arm's length, quite a bit of distance to the private sector, a lot of skepticism, a lot of distrust about motivation and really, whether or not the private sector has the same motivations that the rest of us do to take on a number of these issues, or if it's only profit driven. I think I come from a world where I think you can actually be both. I think you can be profit motivated and altruistic and have a good social responsibility North Star to guide you. And so we've really opened up our engagement and our cooperation with private sector. And what's really important for us, which is where it kind of comes back to the example of how we're trying to work in places, whether it's Ukraine or in some of the other countries that I've mentioned, it's really about making sure that we can partner with local SME, small, medium-sized enterprise private sector entities. And that's hard. They're not always, sort of rich with the right resources, the right technical capacity, the right sort of amount of bandwidth or resources to be able to partner. But it's really important for us that, our only engagements are not with global multinationals, who oftentimes don't tend to always have that localized, contextualized sort of understanding of how to adapt what it is they're doing, whether it's in automation, whether it's in seed systems, whether it's in animal vaccines. And so finding the right local partners, local private sector, local NGOs, the university, the academic, the research institutions who are there at the country level. For us, so much of what we deliver, we know has to be affordable, it has to be adaptable, it has to be contextualized to that local setting. And so that changes the nature of how you do partnerships. But that's a very high priority for us, is really building more proactively and more strategically these right kinds of private sector partnerships, so that they are providing not resources to FAO, but that so they are making real investments at the country level. That they are investing in innovation, in digital tools, in transformations of agricultural and food systems that are right for that particular country.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that you can't do this without the private sector. So the issue is so big, and as you noted in the beginning, not going in the right direction. You have to bring in these different entities to try to take this on, and the localized aspect is. I'm glad you made that point as well. That's very so important, because it isn't necessarily a plug and play to every single place. Every place is unique.
All in food and agriculture. And I know that from growing up in Indiana. What we do on our farm, given the size, given the agronomic conditions, given the market opportunities, is different than what you see in Vermont, in Texas, or in California. So I mean, this idea of trying to define singularly what food and agricultural systems should look like is not, it's not practical. It's not reasonable, and it's not how we're trying to, I think, contribute to each of these kinds of national approaches to what can really bring that right kind of transformation in food and agriculture, but then ultimately get to this place where you're able to, I think, turn the tide on these trends of food insecurity that we've been seeing.
Yeah. So I'll get you out of here on this last question. And you mentioned the partnership initiative and collaboration with the private sector is one of the main sort of near-term goals and what FAO is working on and everything. So in order for us to be able to turn this back around and rescue, as the Secretary General mentioned, this SDG, what are one or two other things that FAO is really leaning hard into with that in mind?
Yeah, I would talk about two things, or mention two things. One, we are really leaning in on science, technology, and innovation, and that too may seem a bit obvious to many who are looking for new and innovative ways to kind of take on or tackle kind of big problems. But I would say that a little bit, as I mentioned, about our sort of history with private sector engagement in food and agriculture, especially food, innovation and technology can oftentimes be quite controversial. When it comes to technologies that tie to food, it's not like the, sort of next, very sought after iteration of technology that comes on our mobile phones or in every other part of our life. And it's part of that sensitivity and that personalization that we all have to food. And so whether it was, things like genetic modification, genetic engineering, similar types of food related. I mean, here we are now in a space where in at least developed countries, alternative proteins, culture based, cellular based meat products. I mean, there's a lot of advancement that's happening in food and agricultural related innovation. And this was a space where, again, because there were different national policies, different priorities, some governments that chose not to take on new innovations or new technologies or to promote them. It became inside our organization a bit of a challenging sort of channel to try to navigate. And I think our current leadership really feels, though, like there won't be the solutions, there won't be the fixes to agriculture unless digitalization, science, innovation are just fundamentally embedded in new ways of doing what, historically we've been doing to grow food. And so really embracing that, again, it doesn't maybe sound like all that novel perhaps of a response, but operationally, it's a huge change for an organization like ours to advocate and to speak out so openly and try to provide with other partners science-based, evidence-based support to countries to help them make decisions about how to adopt new technological practices, new innovations, and to bring those on board. So being a real champion and an advocate for where innovation comes into play in agriculture is one. The second one is even probably, in some ways, I hate to end on it because it's probably not so interesting to everyone, but we have to be better operationally. Internally in this organization, we're growing at such a pace. There have been so many more investments in the work of our organization that in a leadership role at least, it's really important to be able to deliver at scale. And so we are an organization that, moving into these emergency settings, speed, timeliness, agility, flexibility, these are all requirements for getting this kind of work done and done effectively. And FAO is an organization that hasn't always been pushed to operate that quickly. So whether it's procurement, logistics, human resources, getting the right people in the right countries at the right time, all of this space of being able to respond and respond quickly on programs that just a few years ago were only in the millions or tens of millions of dollars for us, and now are in the hundreds of millions of dollars because of really significant investments that have come our way from a number of donors and partners that see this opportunity for more agricultural production support to come into these countries. That is something that's a really important aspect of being able to deliver as the UN, because I think a lot of our donors and other partners sometimes question the efficacy. What is the return on investment for supporting an organization like ours, and making sure that we can really deliver at scale is something that is also a really big commitment on our part to make sure that trust and that confidence and our ability to keep contributing in these different places is maintained.
All right, Beth Bechdol, Deputy Director General of the FAO and proud Georgetown alumna. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, Hoya Saxa. Thanks.
Thanks very much for having me.
So after listening to that, you can probably tell that the scope and scale of food insecurity can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around. The numbers we're talking about here are sadly immense. But luckily we have organizations like the FAO that's fighting the good fight on food insecurity every day. Thanks again to Beth Bechdol for coming on and talking to us about the innovation and partnerships that will be central to any effort to tackle this mounting challenge. And don't forget to check out the links in the show notes to learn more about this issue and policy solutions and what we've done on food insecurity here at ISD. Until we meet again.